It's really a pleasure having you. I
Thank you
think,
so much. A pleasure being here.
yeah, it's great. I think we know each other since probably
Ale, probably.
2011 or something.
Yeah,
Ale, the first Ale Agile Lean Europe Unconference, which you
in
brilliantly
Berlin.
served at, and was this first step in the movement, spanning across Europe and even beyond. And a lot of time has passed since then, and you went from tech into a larger corporate. For everyone who's tuning in now, we agreed upon we're not talking about the company you work for. We just know it's a quite a famous company in the streaming world, but there's many more interesting things going on nowadays. I was just looking at my Google shares. Google is doing a lot of things, thinking about, hey, they split shares now, and I will become more rich in the near future. Apple is announcing new stuff. Tesla is doing so many crazy things, specifically in manufacturing. So we don't need to focus on any specific topic, although online media is a topic. Yeah, so
Mm.
that's the thing here. And first thing, ground rule, just for everybody who is listening, watching, feel invited to post your comments, your questions, whatever you have into the chat that might be on LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll be just happy to pull it in as it fits into the conversation and then basically bring you into the conversation. So that's the first thing. Um, and now we start with Marcin. Let's talk about you. Maybe you want to give us a few words about you, about what you're doing. What's your main focus in work? Yeah,
Right.
that's basically maybe the intro.
Yeah, so I'm tuning in from a wonderful, although very dark by now, Stockholm. Fortunately, we have a little dusting of snow, which is lovely. Uh, Not so common these days with the climate change and everything. Um, I have started my journey in being very much a hands-on engineer and building software very directly with customers. And I think before I even knew about, well, way before I knew that something like Agile will exist, um, it turned out I worked in a way that was later, I think, very much aligned because I basically talked to my customers directly every couple of weeks, went away, wrote a bit of software, went back, showed it to them, and got their feedback, and iterated like that. And that was just not something that I was taught. That was just the only way I could think of making this work. I had no idea of any methodologies or any ways in which I could collect documents or create big specs. And that turned out to work really well for me. I think for the first 10 years, that was something that was a really pleasurable experience because I could really see the impact that I could have with the work that I was doing on the people. And then I moved countries, moved from Poland, where I come from, to the UK, and started working for other companies. That was actually the first time probably that I actually properly worked at a larger company. And I saw this reality where people had way more structure and way more process and way more documentation. And I be very honest, like in the very early days, I was actually drawn into that. One of my first jobs was actually writing specifications for engineers to implement it. I was a technical architect, I guess. Um, but of course, very quickly, I realized that what I actually did was write some code and then describe it in a document so that someone else could write that code again. I mean, that felt a bit silly eventually.
Hmm.
And that was around the time when Agile was beginning to become more and more popular and people were embracing that. So I had a really good fortune of working with some of the really smart people in the industry who really understood what could software development beyond a single person or a small group of people look like, that did not rely on very strict and heavy documentation, for example, and handovers and long lead times and upfront planning. And I really went from there, went a little bit into management, realized that my influence with code is maybe a little bit limited. And if I want to scale myself in a way, we're already leading into maybe some later conversations, I could do that by engaging more with other people and supporting people and creating the right environment for others to do amazing work. I met so many great engineers and realized that I could probably never be as good as they are, but I can certainly try and help them be more effective in what they're doing. And one thing led to another. Been through the usual, doing a lot of agile coaching, consultancy, and managing smaller and increasingly larger groups of people. And that journey has taken me, together with my family, to Sweden, where now I've been for the past 6.5 years.
Now, that's quite an interesting thing you just mentioned before when you said your influence, or what was it, your influence as software engineer or producing code or anything was limited. And I think it's an interesting consideration. Of course, I mean, if you're the president of the United States, you by definition have some influence. So that's the first thing. Second, of course, if you're the CEO of a large company like Novartis, same thing somehow. But at the same time, like, you're working in a tech company, right? And tech is actually driving the world. And it's quite interesting to say, it wouldn't be a software engineer be, considered, if it's really a good, a skillful person, involving himself or herself, be more powerful than any manager in the world? I mean, any manager in a typical organization, call it this way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I believe that's the case, although I don't actually think that an individual can do that on their own. I think that's the difference now, that the ambition that we have. I mean, one, the opportunity of building really large systems has just exploded. The complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve with software is increasing. So it is, no longer the case that an individual engineer can really solve all the problems or build something significant. But I very much agree that the real ability to make the difference and to change the world in many ways sits with the people who can actually tame those bits and bytes and create amazing experiences through working together on building so much more that is becoming software today.
Yeah, right. And by the way, I was really thinking about this, software being a social activity as such, not this lonely hacker somewhere in a room somewhere in the North Pole or something, but really this sort of, hey, we're creating something that's literally not, you cannot machine generate great software. I mean, this idea from the early 80s or something, this case and everything, these approaches for great solutions, for innovative approaches, no. And it's for people. So it's people creating very meaningful, platforms for people. So there's huge influence, right?
Yes.
And so now you're in management. Okay, let's get back to your status quo. And since quite a long time, right? Since 6-7 years, as far as
I probably 10 by now.
Even 10 years. So that's quite a long time. How is it like? I mean, you're in a tech company. It's not a typical bank. And I always say, well, everybody says a bank is actually a tech company, at least as long as it is considering the future. Like everybody says, software is eating the world.
Yeah.
How's it different to be a manager in a tech company, which is known as a high-tech company, or more leading? Could be Google, could be anyone else.
Yeah.
How is this as a role now changing what are you focusing on? To which extent is tech still a topic here? How is management more than just, organizing stuff in a hierarchy, or is there even hierarchy in your job?
I mean, of course there is hierarchy. Let's deal with that first. Of course there's hierarchy in a sense that I think we're all human beings. And as we get into larger groups, some hierarchies inevitably evolve. And, we can talk about formal and informal hierarchies. But what I like to talk, or think at least a little bit about, is that while there's always some hierarchy, and hopefully that hierarchy is there to support the organization, and, for example, help with the horizon at which people think about the future. Right, like very typically you think about, like, there are some people who try to take a much long-term view, and some people who try to take that long-term view and translate it into what should we be doing now. But apart from hierarchies, we also have networks. And I think that is becoming increasingly important. So like these connections among all the people who are building software. So I think, you talk about tech companies, which of course most of us are now in, and
Right.
almost all companies are turning into tech companies.
Yeah.
But I like to abstract it a little bit further out into also knowledge work, because that's really what we're doing. And I think that the aspect of the knowledge work is the important aspect which shapes how we as managers, for example, act in the organizations. And tech is just an added cherry on top, because it is such a, I'd say, maximizer of our possible impact, right? Like we can do so much more by building software that people can interact with than, for example, writing text or writing books that people can read.
Yeah. I like what you said about knowledge work, because I think that points us also to the question: what's the ratio between, connecting knowledge or existing knowledge versus co-creating new knowledge, or whatever it is, insights and everything. And probably we are more and more going into this. There's always something new coming to the table as soon as two or three people put their heads together and use their experience, their skills and everything, and suddenly they are creating something new. Something is emerging. But I like also the hierarchy thing. Of course, I love. I mean, hierarchy is something we can obviously talk, like power hierarchy, and
Yes.
also we're social animals. I mean, animals, but everybody knows. As long as we're in sociology, there will also be always some sort of power, even on
Yes.
eye level. It's just a question how we
Absolutely.
deal with power, right?
Yes.
The other question, what you said, yeah, please.
No, actually, you've triggered something, and I
Hmm.
want to share with you and with anyone else
Hmm.
who's joining in. One aspect of thinking about power, because I very much agree, power is always there, and it's very important. It's one
Hmm.
of the ways in which we influence each other, right? Like it's
Yeah. Yeah.
it is important to understand, like for us to orient ourselves and understand, like where are the decisions happening, where's the knowledge coming from. Everybody has ideas. Are these ideas the same? How do we reason about these ideas?
Mm.
But I think in many, let's call them more traditional organizations, um, that have like very strict hierarchies, the notion of power is considered as something that is a finite resource, right? Like there's a
Mm.
finite amount of power in the organization, and usually most of that power is concentrated at some sort of top.
Yeah.
And what I like to think about is that what we really want to do is increase the amount of power. So,
Mm.
people sometimes talk about empowerment. I think that's
Hmm.
one word. I'm not a huge fan of that, because that
Hmm.
implies that someone has power and gives it to someone else. I
Hmm.
rather think about like co-creation, and therefore allowing people, like growing more bases of power, more sources of power, and
Hmm.
understanding that they come from like all sorts of places in the
Hmm.
organization, and that giving someone else more power or allowing other people to have power does not take away from some of the power that you might have.
Yeah, nice. That's this typical win-win thing, right? To say we're actually growing together. It's not about win-lose or this zero something. What you're
Exactly.
doing.
And we're already starting to understand this when it comes to the
Mm.
market, right? Like,
Mm.
where
Yeah.
competition suddenly creates, a bigger pie for everybody,
Mm.
and new innovation. So I think the same kind of thinking can apply to how we think about power dynamics in
Mm.
organizations.
Hmm. Attaching to this, because you just mentioned it, I mean, tech companies very often now look at this platform business, right? Platforms, 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 because they are giving the lever to towards something turning exponentially at a certain point. And at the same point, this exactly goes into the direction of saying, hey, there is competition. As long as it's healthy, it's good. But there is more, right? There's still this connection and co-creation. So because otherwise, I couldn't run a platform. If I'm still running the old mindset to say, well, first you have to pay. Here's the contracts, and so, what's your experience with that in this kind of industry, even providing solutions for the platform industry? Has that changed your experience to work with other vendors and people? And how's your experience in this field?
Yeah, I'm.
Maybe also your outlook. It depends. What
Yeah,
we have an experience already, or what we assume will come in the near future. To say, focus on that.
I think for me, the thinking about platform is much more about how we think about the people we work with outside of the organization.
Right.
So, like a very typical model, B2B or B2C, right, where those roles are very strictly defined and well understood, and like the economics go only in one way, usually, right?
Exactly.
Someone pays for the service and gets some sort of value in front. And I think if we start thinking about this more platform reality, I think that balance shifts. Like, it's not just a one-way relationship. What we're really trying to do is build a more dynamic and more bi-directional relationship. And that goes back to what you said, Mike, around co-creation. Like, we're inviting people to create something with us, and on one part we're supporting this platform, but that platform isn't on its own valuable if you don't have people who create on top of that platform.
Yeah. I think that could be a own rabbit hole to dive into. But by the way, I'm just recognizing we share something in common, because I see in my bag and your bag there's a similar Lego.
Very good. That was a little bit
talking about diversity and co-creation, everything, right? It's nice culture. One thing, I mean, talking a little bit about experience, companies out there, like really high-tech companies, and by the way, there's already a couple of people showing up who are showing their enthusiasm. Like here's Priyank, obviously, jumping into something that might be interesting for you. I'm just putting it here. I think engineering and software engineering is such an interesting thing today. At a certain point in time, the former startup becomes potentially a label in the field, and not only by stock exchange and investors, there are high expectations, but I think very often we start looking at these organizations and assume their identity, assume who they are, what they are, and Apple is a very nice thing about that. Everybody still assumes this is actually still Steve Jobs, and it's just the other guy now on stage. But how does that become a potential, say, hurdle or something where you say, we're expected to be like this? And what does that finally mean for our future? Because maybe we will change directions totally. And that was a very common thing in the recent past, to say, right? Some companies just turned into something completely different. Just think about what was this? Flickr, was it, right? Flickr gaming, massive online gaming thing. But nobody would think about this. I mean, think about your company or anything alike. Yeah. Google is Google. Everybody assumes, hey, Google is, we know what Google is. We just expect a 40% revenue increase every year. But isn't that a big problem?
I mean, it's like a success trap, right? You're finding something that works, and then you try to latch onto that and basically solidify in some way that way of working. So I've had, the good fortune of experiencing my company and some other companies as well, really challenging that notion and realizing that actually and I think growth is one of the things that helps in here, because as your organization grows and adds more people, the dynamic changes. And that's one of the forcing factors to kind of make you rethink if the way you're organized or the way you work or the way you connect with people, the way you're structured, does that still work or not?
Right.
And I think in some extent it is super hard now for many organizations to be out there visible, like sometimes on the pedestal, because you feel like you need to live up to some sort of expectation. And I think it's super important to try and ignore that and focus on, what is the vision or the goal that the company has, what you're trying to achieve, and find whatever ways that help you achieve that goal, of course, in an ethical and positive way, but not so much trying to get consumed by the picture, like the public vision that you have externally.
Yeah. Roman, I'm just putting it in here. It's a side note. It's not about what we're just talking about. He tries to prove me wrong, to say computers are getting better at writing their own code, but no worries for software developers, which I believe.
A little digression. You mentioned Tesla in the beginning here, and I think that's a fantastic example we could touch upon a little bit, because of course there's like all of the AI systems that they're building, and there you could argue that the kind of traditional notion of code is going away, because the code is no longer the code. It's the models like AI models, ML models that are embedded into those matrices that have like been developed through the machine learning processes, like whatever the different learning models, right? But there's still a very important place for you can say engineers, developers, however we're going to call them in the future, where you're actually maybe no longer work on the lower level details of like actually, how is this model coded up, but what is the training data sets? Like that is something that the machine won't be able to do itself yet. We hope not for a long time. And actually, those I think one great example was the AI feature of windscreen wipers that reacted to rain. That in the early versions worked really well when you were driving outside, but really failed when you drove into a tunnel. Because it turned out that the AI model was not trained on pictures that included tunnels. And water in the tunnel, because it usually doesn't rain in the tunnel, but sometimes there's spray and all that water. That something that you really have to think at a high level of abstraction. But that kind of creative thinking will always be required.
It's this sort of, I mean, as long as things are somehow linear, I mean, they aren't obviously in this field, so it's all about networks, but trivial idea to say there is a catch-all phrase somewhere and say, oh, for the rest of the thing, I don't know anything. But I think that's the big thing still to come, right? We're talking, when we say AI, I sometimes laugh about Google Maps, for example. Like people talk about Google Maps, and of course there's a lot of stuff behind, but I don't know how often Google Maps drives me into directions where I just have to laugh. So as soon as it's a little bit off, how can I say, off-road, it becomes interesting. And I always say, all right, and people fear AI, but all right, this is just joking. I think we're in front of something. We don't know when it happens. That's this exponential thing, right?
Yes.
And when that will really hit in, our usual science fiction movies might become outdated somehow. I believe.
Exactly. I think even the thing that we're doing right now it might be a good example to consider. So of course the quality and the fidelity of the video and sound that we can have in this interaction has been steadily increasing, but it has really not produced any significant material difference in the experience that we have. I mean, it just looks nicer and crisper, but I'm still not in the same room with you, Mike. But but I think at some point that incremental compounding improvement in quality may trigger something that is that creates a new quality that we cannot just yet imagine.
But I can imagine you think about holography and things like that, 3D and all of these things. But coming back to real life, I mean, say to 2022, which is already quite far ahead. I think you mentioned growth, and I like to stick to this word a little bit, because growth, we know, business people know, if you don't grow, you're going to die somehow. You can't run a business where you say we don't grow, we keep it stable, so that somehow this doesn't work in a market economy or in a free market.
Let's not go on a tangent whether that's okay or not.
But the interesting thing is actually, now if you're a software company, I mean, the question really is, what do we mean by grow? Why, it's like, do we just have more? Do we need more features in less time? More people to grow more stuff? Or is that somehow in correlation with each other? What does growth actually mean? In what direction? Is it just territory to say we cover a broader, bigger market, so we just become more volume? What do you feel?
Yeah, I feel like there's not one and easy answer here. There's definitely something that I have realized, working at the larger organizations, that providing a certain level of experience at a certain scale in terms of the number of users and the diversity of devices that you support and the number of countries that you support brings with itself a level of complexity that needs to be matched with we have this law of requisite complexity, if you like, to bring something smart into our conversation. That says that basically the system that creates the solution needs to match the complexity space in which the solution operates. So I think from that perspective, there is an argument to say that we need to have, that level of, let's say, size, right, in terms of the number of engineering teams and the topics that these engineering teams are working with, that fuels that growth. Yeah. Right. So it's just basically matching the scale and the possibility. I think you talked about features. Of course, it's. I mean, it's hard to keep adding features to a product, but I'm sure we've all seen the super heavily overloaded apps. Like the real magic is when you can create and add more functionality in a way that doesn't weigh the application down. It doesn't feel like you're just a lot of more stuff coupled together and bolted on top, just so that you have everything in the same app. Exactly. I think there's another thing that drives this, and I think we really need to think about this in the industry. So as we are able to serve more customers at a higher speed, a higher bandwidth, more locations around the globe, the complexity of the technology that we're using is increasing. And I think sometimes maybe, there was this great podcast I listened to the other day, and one of the questions I was asked there was like, when was it the hardest to be an engineer building software? And I really liked the answer, because the answer was, tomorrow is the hardest day to be an engineer. Because because there's just so many platforms, so many libraries, so many different solutions, so many clouds, right? So many versions of scaling frameworks when it comes to software, that it's very hard to keep like understanding all of that complexity and being able to deal with that. Like when things work well, they work well, but we get to the point where they are at such a scale that suddenly when they break down, and that's a super common feature of complex systems, is they're super robust, but they're also susceptible to these large events where things break down catastrophically.
Yeah. I think you're raising a really big point. I mean, first of all, that is at a certain point probably more and more, if not already, but more and more unmanageable. So what we said before about AI, that should also be a helper here. And by the way, talking about a true AI, why would I need an app with all these features, with all these buttons, when I just say, hey, and I'm not giving it a name now, please play this and that. We already have this crap, right? I mean, I have Amazon, how's she called? Yes. Alexa. Yeah. And of course I plucked her out because she was suddenly intervening our conversations at our dinner table. Yes. Although it wasn't supposed to. Sometimes fun, but with kids, sometimes it brings in words you don't want to hear. And but it will come at a certain point, and suddenly we don't need to think about anymore UX in terms of screens, right? I mean, there might be one screen somewhere, but actually I don't care about the screen as such, right?
I mean, this is fun. I think we have a long way to go. My favorite example is, I'm driving somewhere. I have, of course, a phone that can react to this. And we're driving in Sweden, and the kids go like, oh, how many people live in New York? So we go like, okay, hey, how many people live in New York? It's like, yeah, you're going to be 28 hours drive to New York. Like, I don't want to go to New York. Like, in this context, every city is a destination. Yeah, no,
that's a good one. So that is one thing. And what you mentioned, I've nearly forgot that drives us close to edges of danger, right? Because what you mentioned is also, what we talk about power outages today. Nobody can think about that suddenly everything is down, where everything is controlled by as an IP address, and shit, nothing works anymore. And that's close to catastrophe. Not only because we feel uncomfortable, but because, I don't know, atomic power plants might not work for a long time anymore, or any critical infrastructure or anything. So that's a very, very interesting topic.
Sobering thought, right?
Exactly. We don't want to talk much about it. But what I would rather love to dive into You mentioned scaling. That's like a buzzword.
Yes,
Oh shit, that triggers something, right? And
it
scaling
does.
of technology is one thing, but scaling of organizations
Mm.
is another one. And when I come back to what you said, Ashby's law, complexity, complexity, isn't it as a conclusion what we observe very often the case that we say, all right, we need to scale up and scale and become bigger, that our complexity, our capacity for complexity inside the organization diminishes or at least goes down because actually we have inefficiencies due to organizational scaling. And now we suddenly can't meet the external complexity anymore. What's your
So
experience here? I mean,
yeah,
you guys are in this phase, right? Grew from smaller to larger to
yeah.
larger.
I think what comes with so yeah, I'm not going to even suggest that I have any understanding of the complexity science,
Me
but I
neither.
sometimes try to double in this and try to
Yeah.
see what useful lessons we have
Right.
from there. And one of the things that I sometimes hear people say, like, we need to control complexity or we need to manage complexity.
Yeah.
That's probably more
Funny. Yeah.
frequent.
Hmm.
And I always go like that is the best way in which you like demonstrate that you actually don't understand what complexity is about, because being able to manage something means you can understand the relationships between cause and effect, and a
Mm.
complex system makes that impossible. So when like organizations grow and there's more complexity in it, your that complexity generates emergent behaviors. Some of these emergent behaviors are desirable and some of them are undesirable.
Yeah.
And we kind of can't really control it. We can nudge the system, and when we see more
Mhm.
undesirable things, we want to tune them down and we want to have more of the desirable things. But we can't really control it. So what happens is we try to create rigidity in the system because we're afraid of those undesirable consequences.
Yeah.
But that basically kills that complexity as well. And then
Yeah.
that's when you go into like, okay, our scale means we have to have more control, more visibility, more things better defined. We have to have explicit processes that, of course,
Mm.
eventually spiral out into
Mm.
full-blown bureaucracy and things like
Mm.
this. So that's, it's very hard to actually be comfortable in complexity because you are always faced with, sorry, my kids are
Yeah.
running around,
Yeah.
always faced with things that are you can't control, with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that is not really something we as humans generally feel comfortable with.
Yeah. I think what I take away from what you just said, that's what I already imagined, is when we might even understand complexity, but when we try to get it under control, it's all about fear, because high uncertainty, we don't know what's happening, what could happen if, the scenarios we talked about before, that drives a lot of fear. So what else could we do instead of just saying, hey, then we're capable of doing something about it, so let's do it, even if we don't believe it will work, or at least not for the good alone. But another interesting thing is, the first interesting thing, talking scaling organizations, you're coming from a background where you're a little bit, known for models, and we know there is bigger, huge models. I mean, there's one I even don't want to call it, but the agile world is full of these scaling models, and I'm not sure. What's your thoughts about these models? Is that something? Is that also about fear that we turn to those because it's like, hey, that's tangible. That's something we can hold on, and specifically when it's at scale, right? And I'm not talking to 5 people now, but I'm
No.
talking to thousands of people. It's helpful to have a blueprint, right? I
Yes.
understand
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is our way of trying to deal with that huge uncertainty.
Hmm.
We're trying to create some sort of structures and boundaries that help us understand how we operate and give us fairly simple rules. I think we're kind of really drawn to those, solutions, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because that always reminds me of this quote from Taichi Ono, if I have it right, that always urged people saying that, don't borrow wisdom from others, but think
Mm.
and think and think for yourself and solve your own problems in your own context.
Yeah,
And that was, that was
Yeah.
expression of the understanding that every single organization is in some way unique, and that context, as in, the kind of people you have, the kind of culture you have, the kind of resources you have, the buildings you have, even the color of the paint that you used for your walls influences how people behave in that system. And so the only working solution is to try to create some sort of understanding of this.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know in the agile industry, there is also the opposite word, which is descaling. To say, actually, when we say scaling, we don't assume we're growing more structure and more stuff, right? But rather keep it more simple and connect the dots, right? To say, you mentioned it before, network is the answer here. And how could we control, coming back to this idea, control a network? Well, I don't know how we can. I mean, we had a guest recently, last end of last year, here on board from Hayer, with his Hayer background. They're running huge networks, right, with 60, 80,000 people, and it's all small units. And of course, you can't control everything here. You can't. You even don't want to, probably, because that would go wrong. Probably the
I
wrong
think
way.
that's the point. I mean, I think we really need to become more comfortable with the fact that control is just not a mechanism that works in this context. Some of the things that I believe are actually helpful. So first of all, one of the growth and scaling reflections could be, I really like that you talk about scaling up and scaling down, because that is something that organizations should really, really consider. Like, scaling is not a one-way street. You can choose to scale up and you can choose to scale down, and both have their merits, because sometimes actually, adding more people, if that's the way we scale up, is just not helpful, right? It's not as helpful as it should be.
Yeah.
And then
yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So and then there's a bunch of like reflections I have around like what in that scenario is helpful instead of trying to instill control. So we could talk a little bit about that, but we could look at the question as well. What do you think?
Well, it's a comment somehow, but I would love to bring it into your direction, because agile management, and that triggered me now, like, because that's even the question what that is, agile management. And now that we recognized you are a manager, if you like it or not, since quite a long time, and you work in such environments, what do you think about this change in management perspectives, or is it different styles, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it changes quite a lot. I think it's we still have a legacy of seeing management as, well, we have this legacy of this division of labor, which of course before was managers do the thinking and employees do the doing. Like, that's long gone, because that's just not how we operate anymore. But we still have this, like, managers do the decision making and the strategic thinking, and people, employees, workers do the implementation, if you like. Right? And I think that division is no longer helpful. Like, we're fortunately, and that little Lego set hopefully is a good reminder of that, is that diversity is what creates stability in complex systems. And therefore, like, everyone's voice is important. Everyone's voice needs to be heard, and they can create, like, and only by getting a lot of voices together, we can find solutions to the problems we have. Now, that is hard. That is hard because that very often can trigger things like conflict that we generally are very good at avoiding. And so if you have, a hierarchy and very strong management, they're usually there primarily to solve conflicts. Like, they're making the decisions that people in the organization are not able to make themselves. But rather than using that solution as, like, an arbiter, ultimately, we could instead help people be more comfortable with that conflict, create a level of safety. We could talk about psychological safety in this context. Create a safety in which that conflict actually creates positive outcomes, even if it's uncomfortable in the moment for people. And there, I think the managers have a great responsibility and an opportunity to actually help people navigate those conflicts, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge topic, right? I mean, it's about status. It's about, I have an opinion. I think something. How, to which extent am I interested even, or ready to give up, or to integrate, or anything alike? Because in the first place, it's no problem to talk conflict, because obviously we just recognize, or let us recognize, there is something which is different, right? And our opportunity is now to navigate through this, or to fight about it. So that's the extremes, and a lot of models out there. But now, coming back to the scaling, actually, so it's interesting, because management is obviously, and if we call it management, we talk a little bit more about leadership. And the nice difference is, obviously, management is really assigned to roles. Although you might say also, hey, management, the system is managing itself somehow, and we don't know where. And it doesn't need to be managers to take care for it. Second, leadership is obviously more than just a role or a position in English. So is that something you're working on constantly? This question about, hey, I'm a manager in a large company, and again, take companies like yours. I mean,
Yeah.
manager roles are something, right? Being the senior vice president of Google, I think that's not just a servant leader who is ready to serve the world. It's a very powerful position in a very hyped, let's say, economy.
Yeah.
How do you think about this, getting this together?
I mean, that is something that actually, at least I tend to think quite a lot about, because I think we're on the journey, and that journey is currently a little bit like we could see that this language is changing. Like you said, we're actually starting to talk less about managers, even though I think that like some sort of management, like there is value in that sort of skill set. But we talk about much more about people now being leaders, right? Like it's not so fashionable anymore to be a manager. You're now a leader. And then we talk about the fact that we want everybody to be a leader in the organization, or at different times, right? Which I think is a great great direction. I still keep thinking, like, do we really need, like, this leadership still implies some imbalance. So how can we evolve this in a direction where we're, again, back to the word we've used before, like co-creation or co-leadership? So some folks use this word that they actually really like, fellowship, right? So that we're somehow trying to, I don't know, be more democratic in what we do. I would probably rather say more inclusive, to really, again, elevating all the voices. But still, of course, we talked about positional power earlier in this conversation. And I think what I like to see is that positional power is actually, rather than used to make the decisions or set the direction, to help elevate the voices that are important but are not naturally heard in the organization.
You're literally repeating what we had on our last call with our guests, Maricha Friedman from
Sorry,
Sierra.
we're being
No, it's not.
boring now.
No, it's not repeating. It's like you're
I know.
tuning into the same kind of thinking. And Frank Uitevert, they wrote a book. It's called Systems Inspired Leadership, and it's actually about this idea of saying leadership first of all. Do you have it? Otherwise, I give it to you, because I already have two of them. You have it. Nice, beautiful. All right. And did you read it already? Right? Because it's hard, but to read all the but it is this idea of, and I think that makes it easier, right? If I say it's a property, it's a capacity of the system, right? And let's say system is my company, then we can think about, it doesn't need to be occupied by just one person or by a defined role.
Yes.
But that's the idea, right?
I mean, I find it so refreshing, but at the same time, I know it may be so uncomfortable when you consider that that system is an entity in its own right, that there's something that is outside of just the people who are there. Like, one of the things that I loved in this book was this idea that whenever there's a conflict, there's that's a signal that something is trying to happen.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. I love that idea, because very often we try to extinguish the conflict and consider this as something negative.
Yeah.
But instead, this gives us an opportunity to look at conflict as something that actually is meaningful and positive, because that can, help us discover what needs to happen in the system next.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, to recap a little bit our scaling discussion, I was just thinking about, let's see what you think about this idea. I mean, scaling of structures, I think we might rethink the pictures we have in our head. That's the first thing. It's not this hierarchy becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. It's rather the opposite. And it would be helpful to think about a living organism. And we know living organisms don't benefit from becoming larger and huge, larger. That's rather a disadvantage.
Exactly. And in fact, they have a limit to scale, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the alternative to say, okay, when we really talk about scaling, let's maybe forget about scaling the doing, but more scaling the thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would it be like? What we already said, let's bring voices on board which were not heard. Let's bring our thoughts. Let's see our conversation here. Hey, we're not scaling well to two of us, but how could we make it spread through a whole organization and bring other ideas in? I think that could be the future of scaling in an organization. And again, artificial intelligence will probably help us, for example, to I don't know, search for new ideas where they're currently happening, who is currently talking about what, right? Isn't that the right thing?
Absolutely. And that connects to two things. One, I think there's a way of scaling in my mind that is not about scaling by adding people, but
Yeah.
scaling by increasing the skills of the people we already have.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thinking about like, how can we really leverage the people we already have by giving them new tools, new mental models, new ways of thinking, new ways of working that help them be more effective. That's one. The other one is, and we talked about like, if until we have AI that does that for us, I think we can also rethink the role that leaders can play in an organization. And instead of being about, the decision makers, they can be the integrators and the connectors. I really like this idea of leaders as integrators that, go around the organization and connect these ideas that are seemingly unrelated so that they can meet and produce better outcomes.
Yeah. Piotr was probably just putting the right question here at the table. And that's really for you, Marcin, to say, what do you think about that? What, first of all, influence and what kind of tools? And I think tools is not necessarily something tangible, right? It's more like, what's my repertoire to work with, to become more skillful as a leader?
I think, again, I'm not to hang up too much on words, but influence can sometimes have like this negative sense, right? That we're trying to, in the extreme, coerce people to do something that we want rather than what they want. So I think going back to this idea of maybe the integration, right?
Yeah.
The influence is through helping people, but listening to what's going on, being able to have a system perspective. So we could, pull in some systems thinking here, that, the ability to see the dynamics that happens beyond maybe the small unit. How do all these units that we have connect with each other? And therefore, what would be valuable? Like, I don't know, for example, where are the bottlenecks, or what are the reinforcing feedback loops that we may want to amplify? And where are some of the negative loops that we may want to dampen? Like, these are the tools that I think will become more and more important in terms of creating that, if you like shaping or influencing the organization or the system in the context of the book we just looked at, rather than influencing individuals, for example, in their ways of thinking.
I think
I think that coaching is another super important tool.
A coaching mindset, right? As a leader.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. That moves you probably away. I mean, I'm just thinking about you're now in senior leadership positions. You've been in senior leadership positions, and it's more like, is this heroic leader, because that would be the opposite, to say it's still about me, it's still about us. Is that even still popular? And again, I know the industry is.
I don't know if folks have had a chance to listen to the Elizabeth Holmes story. I really encourage that. It's probably all over the social media these days.
Yeah.
which is a case in point about this heroic leader that
Yeah.
can actually destroy the organization. So I have very long thoughts, and I'm really trying to counter that in my own context. This idea that the more senior leader you are, the more lonely you are. Like there's so
Mhm.
much about
Mhm.
like how lonely it is to be a CTO or a CEO of an organization.
Yeah.
And I just completely don't buy this. I think that is a choice that people are making to go alone on that journey, because of course, like the expectations are super high. The compensation is super high as well, right? So you
Yeah.
feel like you have to live up to that. But instead, like if you can build around yourself a team of people that you do this with that can support you, you don't have to be alone. And in fact, like what I've seen in my organization and other organizations, they're beginning to create leadership groups at every level rather than
Mhm.
individuals. And
Yeah.
of course, you could argue, I mean, in Sweden, it's maybe a little bit easier because we naturally have this tendency to do more collective thinking, be more inclusive. Um, but, thinking about like how can all of these decisions at all levels include more people than just the one lonely CEO or CTO.
Yeah. Yeah. So hope that answered your question a little bit. I mean, it's hard to say answered, but give Piotr a few interesting thoughts about. And what was I just thinking about? Probably Roman's comment here. The conflict you mentioned is at the foundation of the scientific method, falsification. Yeah, I think that's probably this question about how we approach it, right? I mean, that's what we already mentioned. There is a certain skill helpful and required to navigate these things instead of only talking about power, maybe even tending to be narcissistic at a certain point in time somehow.
I mean, I think this is a very. I like this relating this to
Mhm.
scientific method, because we really need to recognize that more and more of what we're going to are doing today and going to do even more of in the future in our organizations is really experiments.
Yeah.
And if we're honest about that work being experiments, whether it's experiments about the products we build, or, which I don't think we do enough, experiments about how we work, um, then some of these experiments have to fail, because otherwise they're not genuine experiments. So how can we create that environment like where leaders are vulnerable, when they can say like, look, I've supported this idea and it failed miserably, and that's not a failure of me. That's how we need to work. Like we
Yeah.
encourage everybody to take those risks. Those risks are super important. But it's super uncomfortable. And you've mentioned at some point, like being on the market, for example, and having some shareholder expectations. And suddenly you're now, taking a stance of doing things that you don't know will succeed. And more often, like, that some of it will fail. So like deliberately engaging in an activity that is bound to fail, but will allow us to learn and understand what to do. Like that's super uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's you really have to take the long-term view, and I think that's
Right.
unfortunately what the market right now is not really encouraging
No.
to the right extent, I would say.
Yeah, that's another problematic point, right? This whole market capitalization and everything. It's probably a hidden aspect, but it's so powerful. I mean, driving this whole industry in the background. Um, but I think that's where your things fit together. Where you said before, we need different tools. We don't need to lead alone. Leader as coach, that can help to approach what you just talked about and what Roman is pointing here to, because we're obviously not talking about simple experiments like saying, hey, let's try something out, right? And see how it goes. It's this in between attention of different interests and all these things. I
and
need to
and
be bold and
yeah.
everything, right?
Yeah, and you talked about living organisms, and I think there's a lot of inspiration to be had from living organisms. For example, in the fact that they are not all identical. Like the parts are not identical, right? That's
Mhm.
something that scaling organizations love, and that's what I don't like about some of those scaling frameworks,
Mm,
because
mm,
they enforce or promote that uniformity across the organization, but that
mhm,
uniformity creates brittleness
mhm,
and stops that late learning. Like if everyone's doing everything like doing exactly the same kind of scrum, then you can't discover that maybe another approach to doing work will be more effective.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sometimes joking and saying, if I would run a large company, I would love my competitors to run a certain scaling framework, and I don't give it a name now, but because that would make my life easier, or would make me sleep safe. But so no, I didn't say that. No, but what I was just thinking, all of this together, do you think we need a different kind of, I don't know, education, like universities? Are the typical MBAs sufficient or even helping us? Like everything we talk about here, right? And more. I mean, this is just teasers.
Yeah,
What
I
needs
don't
to happen?
think, yeah, I don't think I think university is too late, actually, to be honest. I think
Mm,
it needs to start earlier,
mm,
because as long as we start teaching our kids, repeatability, conformity,
mhm,
just, recreation or reproduction of the knowledge that they've given without encouraging them to be curious, creative, ask difficult questions. Like I was a horrible kid at school because I kept asking
mm,
questions. And I remember, like, having a little trip to a lab at some point at high school and being told off by the teacher afterwards because, I asked some ridiculous question about, like, why the sinks were purple, because I wanted to know what chemicals they were using to do a process, but like I couldn't express it quite like that. So I asked, like, why is it all purple here? And they were like, that was a stupid question. Why did you ask that question? Right. So that kind of attitude really has to change. And then, so you talk about MBAs, for example, which now I think some of those programs are getting better, uh, because many of them are just like repeating the same schemas, the same models, the same
mhm.
ways of thinking that aren't helpful.
Yeah. I mean, of course, there are tools, right? There's, tools for financial people. I mean, it's quite complex, even complex, or maybe complicated, but something you have to learn if you want to do your job right. There are great foundations. I'm always pointing to Peter Drucker or things like that, where I could say, this is something humanity should be aware of. But then, in addition, stuff is moving forward, and I would be wondering how come that I mean, anybody would become, learn about management and leadership if they wouldn't spend time with people like you and in known leading organizations to see how it's really going. Because I believe if I come out of an MBA, professional, I mean, like Harvard, whatever, business school, I might have no idea how Google works from the inside. Well, we
Yeah.
probably had a campus visit once, a little bit more different from the normal guys, but I have no understanding how this business works if I don't move closer, right?
Yeah, but I think a lot of that is about recognizing we need to embrace, like, some levels of discomfort. Like,
Mm,
that learning and discovery is just not nice in many
mm,
ways.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
painful, actually. Like it can be
yeah,
physically painful, to
mm,
challenge your way of working or to try something that suddenly people say, they give you, I don't say constructive or just negative critique that what you
yeah,
did. Like, our
yeah,
brains hate that, and it's hard work to work around
mm,
that and
mm,
still use that as a positive signal to say, okay,
mm,
I have something to learn here. Um, and I think the more we become, but going back to education, the more we become comfortable with that discomfort of not knowing, and constantly investing in that curiosity, and actually, I think things like mindfulness super important, because that allows us to escape from that trap of our lizard brains that stop us
mm,
from taking risks where it
yeah,
was stupid in the past, as
yeah,
in
yeah,
millions of years ago, but
yeah.
is essential right now.
Is that something that's supported at your company? Like, I mean, I know at SAP, for example, I know they have programs where they even teach I mean, traditional managers, especially in tech, right? It's not usual to check into any meeting by, first of all, be quiet, have a sort of a minute of silence or anything. And that sounded weird. I know these guys, how they talk about it, and they said it sounded totally weird in the beginning, but now they recognize the benefits.
Oh, absolutely. I think
Yeah.
mindfulness is super valuable. I think self-awareness,
Mhm.
self-management, like, these are
Mhm.
skills that yeah, we're absolutely supporting people with and teaching
Mhm.
them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's how it, yeah, allows you to to be, again, if we go back to the systems inspired leadership, in tune
Yeah.
with the system and being able to pick up on what's going on around us.
Maybe we should follow up with a conversation with Marita and Frank together with you, and dive a little bit, mix a little bit the concept from where they're coming from, where you're coming from. Could be interesting. Oh, let's talk about it.
That would be wonderful.
We're already at the hour, so we're actually close to finishing here. And we have such a topic we didn't touch at all, but I just want to briefly mention it in the end.
Yes.
This whole transformation business is a huge one, right? I mean, lots of organizations want to catch up. We understand probably, and there's an industry of consultants out there, and forgive me, the agile industry is there too. It's all about, that's a lot of money, right? Yes. But what we just talked about, people, we're not born to permanently change and shift and be told how and what, and then we talked, hey, there is the problem with recipes. What do you think about transformation? Is that even useful? Transforming a business?
I think about this, like this is language that comes from a paradigm that you're trying to leave. That's what's most, it's like almost an oxymoron. Like you're trying to use the tools that you're trying to recognize don't work to change the way you work. But many of these transformations are run as a project. They have a timeline, they have deliveries, and they have a definition of done. And I think what we've been talking here about throughout this conversation today is that, and relating to living organs, for example, and this organic growth, that this is evolution, that this is a path that never ends, and that change becomes an intrinsic element. So, whenever you start talking about like big change management programs and, designing that change up front, it is impossible in a complex system to design change for the desired outcomes. So we're using tools from a context which we want to remove, and that's for me fascinating.
Yeah. I think complexity talks about finite and infinite games, right? In terms of a transformation, it wouldn't be what you expect, right? There is no finite thing to say, it's somewhere done, and an interesting thing to think about, but I think we're close to the end. There's just one question here. Why do you think people want to be managers at all? Piotr asks something like, it's since being a senior leader looks like a really hot job, since right now you can make similar money as an IC, what's IC?
Individual contributor.
Individual contributor, right? It's an interesting term too. I recently thought about individual contributor.
I know. I agree.
What is really, that's maybe one of the final questions here. What is driving you to be a manager instead of, again, being an engineer?
Well, if it's my insecurity.
No, it's a tough question. Sorry for that.
No, very good. I mean, it might be my insecurity with my technical skills. If I can actually, live up with all that, deal with all that complexity that exists there. No, but a little bit jokes aside. For me, this is two things. This is passion for people, because really that still gives us an opportunity to work with people and create, like, not work on people, but basically create the conditions or the environment which allows the people to flourish and grow and get better and have joy in their life. Like being able to have some influence on someone else's life is a great responsibility. But when you get it right, and sometimes we do, it's, the reward is amazing. So I think that's one thing that is definitely driving and me to do that. And the other one is again, we go back to the book, just the fascination with the nature of complex systems and how you might try to understand them, create some situational awareness that you can then use to create probes and experiments and nudge the system and see it change. Because I think that will be more and more of what we will be dealing with in the world going forward. Yeah. So we need those skills. And these are skills that can be learned and can be practiced. So having those skills, I'm trying to get them.
Right. Super cool. There's another comment from Roman. Evolution is actually the most resource wasting way of improving life functions. Well, thing is, it's not predictable, right? And
I mean, it isn't. It is if you know the conditions around you.
Yeah.
It isn't if you consider the unpredictability. And I mean, haven't we just been through 2 years of proof, month after month, that that we cannot predict the future. We do not know what we need to prepare for, and therefore, good old set-based engineering. Run multiple probes or multiple tests at the same time and see which one is actually the successful one.
Right.
It's super wasteful if you look at like pure resource utilization. But if you look at the effects and impact, that is the only way we have available to us right now.
Yeah. And I think that brings us back to the idea of learning, right? Learning could be seen as, hey, actually, what do I get for what I'm doing? But the question would be, if you would work against evolution or try to work against evolution, what kind of resource waste could that look like, right? I mean, so there's a lot of detail to that. Well, other stuff is coming in. Let me just see, where was that? Marcin, when I was visiting Sweden a few years ago, you said that true leader understands that he's there for people, not other way around. What are qualities true supposed to have? Years ago, you said that true leader understands that he's there or she's there for people, not other way around. People are not there for the leader. I'm not sure if I understand the question right, but
yeah, I guess Tomasz is asking like, what are some of the other aspects of like true leaders? I think that really captures this. We talked about like being the coach for the leaders, supporting the people, being there for them, but also understanding the system. I think that good leaders do that as well, like work with people and work with the system, work with the environment. But maybe also going forward, make themselves redundant in a way. If we really think about this, models where there's like much more equality, inclusion, co-creation.
Yeah. Brings us back to this idea of, right, leadership doesn't necessarily stick to certain people, but there is actually a broader understanding. Marcin, I have a very final question for you. It's not about the actual content we talked about so far. If you were about to write a book, what would it be about? If you could choose now and have some time, let's say I give you time, go 2 years to an island. What do you think? What would you love to write about?
That's I would lie to you if I didn't ask myself this question already. And I promise you that as soon as I know the answer, I will write that book.
All right.
That's my approach.
Okay. Yeah. And if you would have a choice for the next book to read, what genre or what kind of topic would you choose?
I mean, I now really continue to delve and understand more into scaling from the complexity point of view. So, for example, like how does scale in nature works, but generally just understanding complexity. Right. I think that's something that there's a long way to go there.
Okay.
But I mean, the list of books to read is long.
Yeah.
And I only seem to be adding to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the systems inspired leadership was a great read recently. Right. So,
I love to ask this question in a way to say, what are you currently thinking about? What is your what is currently, what is your daydreams a little bit about? Because you're reading a book, you're currently thinking about certain concepts.
I mean, I would say two things. Like, how can we, first of all, like what does the future of leadership really look like, if it's really leadership at all? And I hope it is not. We could mention the color teal. That's, I don't know, that's one way that people are talking about this, but that's something that really inspires me, because for me that's how you maximize everyone's potential, like that, where you really give people the ability to have full agency in the work that they do. So that is one, and the other one is how, like, as these things grow in complexity and scale, how can we use data to understand that? So what are some of the tools that we can create for ourselves to what data was actually useful in understanding big systems? Right. And I'm not talking about KPIs, but I'm talking about data that is actually useful, actionable, that can be, for example, we know that most metrics that we could think of at organizations that would somehow describe performance are horrible when it comes to aggregating them up. Like, you can't really aggregate metrics from the team level to the boardroom. And I think what aggregates better is stories. So how can how stories work as metrics? I think these are some of the topics that occupy my mind these days.
All right, now I know what you're thinking about. That's probably Kinefin and all these concepts from Dave Snowden and his team, SenseMaker.
Yeah.
It sounds interesting. Yeah, wonderful. Marcin, it was such a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your thoughts. Thanks for your time and being with us. And yeah, wish you all the best for the next steps, and stay in touch, and see you soon.
Likewise, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who had the patience to stay with us, listen to at least part of this conversation.
Final bit here. Agency.
And yeah, +1 for agency.
Right. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.